I apologize for the spill.
It is quite all right. Do not trouble yourself.
Arab prince called the black waitress stupid. Seconds later, she replies in fluent Arabic. The atmosphere was calm and refined, with waiters moving quietly between tables, attending to guests with careful attention. It was the kind of place where every detail mattered, from the folded napkins to the polished silverware. Among the patrons that evening was a young Arab prince. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with the confidence that came from wealth and privilege. His presence alone drew glances from a few people, who whispered quietly among themselves. He was used to people noticing him, used to attention coming easily. Everything in his life had been about luxury, power, and always getting what he wanted. At another end of the restaurant, a young black woman was finishing her preparation for the evening rush. She had been working as a waitress here for a few years, and she knew the place like the back of her hand. She moved with a quiet confidence, greeting each table with a smile, and attending to orders with skill and precision. She was proud of her work. Being a waitress was not easy, but she had learned to handle difficult customers with grace. Patience, she had discovered, was as important as speed when working in a place like this. The prince had arrived with a small entourage, and a table had been prepared in a corner with a clear view of the entire room. He scanned the menu quickly, ordering dishes with a tone that suggested no questions were needed. The waitress approached his table, carrying a small notepad to take the order. She greeted him politely, her voice calm and professional. "Good evening, sir. May I take your order?" she asked, smiling gently. The prince barely looked at her. He flicked his hand in a dismissive gesture, ordering his food in a voice that was sharp and impatient. He had not expected much from the waitress and assumed she would follow his instructions without question. He had interacted with many people who worked in service positions, and often his experience had led him to underestimate them. He assumed they lacked knowledge, sophistication, or intelligence. As the waitress wrote down his order, she noticed a slight edge in his tone. It was the kind of tone that many people use when they think they are superior, when they assume that their wealth or status gives them the right to speak down to others. She had encountered this before, many times, but she had learned to respond with patience rather than anger. She wrote everything carefully, ensuring no detail was missed. Once she finished, the prince frowned at her. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her face. Perhaps he was expecting hesitation or uncertainty. Instead, she stood confidently, holding his gaze without wavering. He did not like this. He was used to people appearing smaller before him, appearing unsure and anxious in his presence. He wanted control, and at that moment he felt it slipping because she was not intimidated. "Are you even capable of understanding this?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "This isn't difficult. Can you manage?" Anger flared inside her for a moment, but she reminded herself that her role was to stay composed. Reacting impulsively could escalate the situation, and she had seen what that could do in a restaurant where people of wealth could be unpredictable. She responded softly, almost as if speaking to herself but loud enough to be heard. "I understand perfectly, sir." "Listen, I'm asking a simple question," he said, his voice louder now. "Are you stupid or just slow? Because I really don't have time for mistakes." Her heart raced for a second, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had a choice: let the insult pass or respond in a way that would assert her dignity. Around them, other diners were beginning to notice. The prince's entourage seemed uncomfortable, but no one spoke. Some patrons whispered quietly, casting furtive glances at the table. The atmosphere had changed from relaxed luxury to tense anticipation. The waitress placed her pen down slowly, maintaining a polite expression. She bent slightly forward, her posture respectful but strong. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision. "I am very capable, sir," she said softly but firmly. "And I can assure you that I will do my job correctly." He had been taught that wealth and power demanded obedience, and that social status defined intelligence. This simple, composed response challenged everything he believed. For the waitress, this was not just about the moment. It was about every experience she had faced in her life where she was underestimated because of the color of her skin, her job, or the assumptions others made about her abilities. She had learned to master situations with calmness and clarity, and this moment was no different. She would not let arrogance or ignorance dictate her dignity. The tension in the room was palpable. Patrons watched silently, some with curiosity, others with admiration for her courage. The prince was used to being the center of attention, but for the first time that evening, the attention was not flattering. He realized that his words, meant to belittle, had instead highlighted his lack of awareness and his prejudice. The waitress, meanwhile, had begun formulating her next words. She knew she had an advantage if she could speak in a language he did not expect her to know. A small, confident smile touched her lips as she prepared herself. She was not angry anymore. She was poised. She was about to turn the tables in a subtle, powerful way. Seconds passed like minutes. The prince shifted impatiently, expecting a flustered reply, an apology, or even a sign of embarrassment. But she remained calm, her eyes steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. The air between them seemed charged with a quiet electricity. The restaurant, once filled with soft music and laughter, was now silent enough to hear the gentle clink of cutlery from distant tables. She cleared her throat lightly, her voice soft but confident. "Excuse me, sir," she began, pausing just enough to capture his attention. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Something in her tone suggested that she knew more than he had anticipated. At that moment, she was no longer just a waitress. She was someone who held knowledge and skills that could surprise even the most arrogant people. She had the power to shift the situation without raising her voice, without being disrespectful, and without losing her composure. It was a rare moment of quiet strength, the kind that demanded attention and respect in the most subtle way. As she prepared to respond fully, the prince realized that the evening was no longer about the meal or the service. It had become a moment where assumptions, prejudices, and attitudes would be tested. He sat back slightly, unsure of what would happen next. Around them, diners watched, sensing that something remarkable was about to unfold, even if they did not yet know the details. And in that calm, poised moment, the waitress knew that the next words she would speak would not just defend herself. They would change the way this man saw her, and perhaps the way he saw everyone he had ever underestimated. The restaurant was unusually quiet now, as if everyone had sensed the tension building at the prince's table. The young waitress took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew that what she was about to do could completely change the mood of the evening. For a moment, she closed her eyes briefly, remembering the countless times she had faced people who underestimated her. She remembered her childhood, the moments when people judged her for the color of her skin or the jobs she did, and how she had always learned to rise above it. That memory gave her strength now. When she opened her eyes, they shone with quiet confidence. The prince, still glaring slightly, leaned back in his chair. He thought he had intimidated her with his words. But the waitress had already made up her mind. She was not just going to respond. She was going to respond in a way he would never forget. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I would like to clarify something." She explained the situation politely but clearly, pointing out the mistake in his assumptions and the disrespect in his words. She spoke with such precision that it was clear she was not only fluent but also knowledgeable about cultural nuances. The prince froze. His eyes widened and he leaned forward slightly. He could not believe what he was hearing. The woman he had insulted, the one he assumed was stupid, was speaking to him in his own language, and speaking it better than he could have expected from someone he thought beneath him. He felt a sudden rush of shock, embarrassment, and curiosity all at once. Patrons at nearby tables had begun to notice. Some leaned forward slightly, trying to catch what was being said, though few understood Arabic. But the tone, the confidence, and the clarity were unmistakable. This was not a random outburst or an angry reply. It was a composed, intelligent, and articulate response that demanded attention. The prince's entourage looked uncomfortable. They exchanged nervous glances. No one had anticipated this turn of events. They had thought that the prince's wealth and status would guarantee smooth interactions and unquestioned authority. Instead, they were witnessing a moment of pure humility, though not delivered in the form of embarrassment. It was a quiet lesson in respect and awareness. For the waitress, the moment was empowering. She felt a surge of pride, not arrogance but satisfaction. She had taken control of a difficult situation without raising her voice or losing composure. She had shown that knowledge, preparation, and calm confidence were more powerful than money or status. She felt a sense of justice, not in punishment, but in proving that intelligence and dignity are not defined by titles or appearances. The prince tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had been prepared to intimidate and belittle, but now he was confronted with an unexpected reality. He realized he had underestimated her completely, and for the first time he felt a small but sharp pang of humility. He had assumed she was incapable, slow, or uneducated, simply based on her job and appearance. Now the truth was undeniable. She was intelligent, articulate, and capable. Around them, the restaurant had become a stage. Other diners whispered quietly among themselves, their curiosity growing. Some were impressed, some were shocked, and some were quietly reflecting on how easily assumptions can mislead people. The waitress's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the prince's flustered state, and it highlighted a lesson that was as old as human interactions. Respect must be earned not just through power, but through behavior and character. The waitress continued speaking in Arabic, but now she chose her words carefully to make them both polite and instructive. She did not attack him personally, nor did she raise her voice. She focused on the facts, pointing out that rudeness does not command respect and that every person, regardless of occupation or background, deserves to be treated with dignity. She spoke with a measured tone, the kind that does not anger but instead forces people to listen and reflect. The prince's eyes narrowed. He felt a mixture of embarrassment and admiration. No one had ever addressed him in such a way before. In his world, people either obeyed or ignored him. Confrontation in the form of intellect was rare. He realized that she had done something more valuable than merely defending herself. She had taught him a lesson about humility without raising her voice or causing a scene. For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. The music, the quiet chatter, the sounds of silverware, all seemed distant. All that existed was the dialogue between two people from very different worlds, connected in that moment by a shared recognition of human dignity. The waitress's voice, soft but confident, filled the space. Her words were not meant to shame but to educate. She had achieved something remarkable. She had turned an act of insult into an opportunity for understanding. As she spoke, the prince's pride began to shift. He realized that this encounter was more than a confrontation. It was a mirror reflecting his own assumptions. He had judged her before knowing her, before giving her a chance to prove herself. And now, faced with her intelligence, composure, and mastery of his language, he could not help but acknowledge that he had been wrong. The waitress paused for a moment, giving him space to process. She looked at him directly, her gaze calm and unwavering. There was no anger, no malice, only the quiet strength of someone who knew her worth and refused to let anyone diminish it. She had turned the power dynamic on its head. The prince finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. It was the first time he had shown vulnerability in this restaurant, in front of staff, patrons, and his own entourage. I did not expect, he began, struggling to find words that would match the situation. He felt a pang of humility he had rarely experienced. For once he was the student, not the authority. The waitress maintained her composure, smiling politely. She had no need to continue the lecture. Her point had been made. The lesson had been delivered with clarity, elegance, and respect. She had demonstrated that intelligence and confidence are not bound by appearance, race, or occupation. Nearby diners exchanged subtle nods of approval. Some whispered quietly to each other, impressed by the courage and intelligence she had shown. The atmosphere, once tense and uncomfortable, began to shift. There was admiration now, a silent acknowledgement that this was a moment worth remembering. The prince, still stunned, slowly nodded in recognition. He realized that he had underestimated her in every possible way. His words had been meant to intimidate, but instead they had been met with grace, knowledge, and skill. He felt a new respect for her, not because she was a servant, but because she was a human being with intelligence, dignity, and the courage to assert herself when it mattered most. The waitress's thoughts were calm. She had faced difficult people before, but this encounter was different. She had taken control without losing her composure. She had turned an insult into a lesson, and in doing so she had empowered herself while challenging someone used to power and privilege. It was a rare and satisfying moment. Finally, the conversation ended. The prince sat back, still absorbing what had happened. His entourage looked at him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. He could no longer act as if the situation had gone as planned. He had been humbled, not publicly humiliated, but quietly, effectively, and with elegance. The waitress returned to her duties, her smile gentle but confident. She had done what she needed to do, and now the rest of the evening would continue as usual. But she knew that this moment would stay with her, and perhaps with the prince for a long time. She had proven in the most dignified way possible that intelligence, grace, and confidence cannot be judged by appearance or occupation. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Patrons whispered quietly, the clinking of dishes returned, and soft music filled the air again. But in the corner, a young prince had learned an important lesson in humility, and a young waitress had quietly demonstrated the power of dignity and self-respect. In that moment, the divide between wealth and status, between expectation and reality, between arrogance and humility, had been bridged, not by confrontation, not by an after the surprising exchange. The restaurant slowly began to regain its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere around the prince's table remained tense. Patrons continued with their meals, but many eyes kept glancing subtly toward the corner where the incident had unfolded. The young waitress moved efficiently from table to table, attending to other customers with her usual calm professionalism. Yet, she could not entirely ignore the lingering weight of what had just happened. She felt a quiet sense of pride but also a responsibility to maintain composure, because the evening was far from over. The prince sat back in his chair, still processing the unexpected confrontation. His face reflected a mixture of astonishment, embarrassment, and, surprisingly, a hint of respect. For the first time in a long while, he realized that his assumptions about people based on appearances and status were not only wrong but dangerously misleading. He had believed that wealth and power automatically commanded obedience and respect, but here was a young woman, a waitress, who had challenged him calmly and effectively. He studied her from across the room. There was a poise in her posture, a confidence in the way she carried herself that he had rarely seen. It was a quiet strength, not loud or aggressive but undeniable. He realized that she had accomplished something remarkable. She had stood up to him without anger, without confrontation, and yet she had made him reflect on his behavior. He felt an unfamiliar sensation, humility, and it was disorienting. His entourage, sensing the shift in his mood, exchanged uneasy glances. They were not used to seeing him in this state. One of them leaned slightly forward and whispered, "Sir, perhaps we should move to another table." But the prince waved the suggestion away. He needed to understand what had happened. He needed to process the lesson he had received. Meanwhile, the waitress continued her duties with calm efficiency, but inside, she reflected on the incident. She had faced arrogance and prejudice before, yet this encounter felt different. This was not just an individual being rude. It was someone wielding power and privilege. someone who had underestimated her completely. She thought about how often people made assumptions about her based on her skin color, her job, or her background. And in that moment, she realized that knowledge and confidence were her greatest tools. She had used both to navigate a difficult situation and in doing so, had claimed a small but meaningful victory. The restaurant buzzed softly around them, yet there was a subtle shift. Patrons who had witnessed the confrontation whispered quietly among themselves. Some praised the waitress's courage in hushed tones. Others discussed the prince's reaction, noting the unusual humility in his demeanor. It was clear to everyone present that something significant had occurred, a lesson in respect and awareness that transcended the usual flow of a dinner service. The prince finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. I did not expect that, he said, almost to himself. His tone was not angry, it was reflective. He realized that he had been careless, assuming that his wealth and status gave him the right to belittle others. He had been arrogant, and now he had been confronted with a truth he could not ignore. Intelligence and dignity do not depend on titles, money, or appearances. He looked at the waitress again, more carefully this time. Her eyes met his, calm and steady, showing no fear, no anger, just quiet confidence. It was a simple gaze, yet it carried immense weight. He felt an unspoken challenge to reconsider his behavior and his assumptions. He had been taught that power meant control, that privilege meant entitlement. But here, he had been reminded that true respect must be earned, not demanded. For the waitress, the moment was not about winning or humiliating anyone. It was about asserting her dignity and ensuring that she would not be dismissed or underestimated. She had demonstrated that knowledge and composure could speak louder than insults or authority. Her thoughts wandered briefly to her life outside the restaurant, to her family, her dreams, and the challenges she had overcome. She realized that each experience had prepared her for this moment. Every struggle had taught her patience, resilience, and the value of remaining calm under pressure. As the evening continued, the prince found himself reflecting more deeply. He considered the lessons he had learned, not just about this young woman, but about the world beyond his wealth and privilege. He thought about how often he had judged others too quickly, assuming inferiority based on superficial traits, and he realized that the encounter had humbled him in a way he had never anticipated. He felt a newfound appreciation for intelligence, for courage, and for the quiet power that comes from knowledge. The waitress moved to another table, taking orders and delivering meals with her usual grace. She smiled politely at the patrons, unaware of the impact she had just made. To them, she seemed like any other professional, competent and attentive. But those who had witnessed the earlier confrontation knew that she had done something extraordinary. She had used her skills, intelligence, and calm demeanor to turn a difficult situation into a moment of empowerment, not just for herself, but for everyone observing. The prince, still seated, watched her work. He noticed the ease with which she handled multiple tasks at once, the way she interacted with customers politely yet confidently, and the way she maintained control over the environment without raising her voice. He began to see her not as a servant, but as a person of remarkable capability and character. He felt respect growing within him, mixed with a hint of guilt for his earlier arrogance. For the patrons, the story of the confrontation began to circulate quietly. Some whispered to each other about the bravery of the waitress. Others commented on the unusual reaction of the prince. People were intrigued by the idea that a single moment of calm intelligence could shift the dynamics of a room and challenge long-held assumptions about status and ability. It became clear that the event was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a powerful demonstration of dignity, respect, and the impact of knowledge. Meanwhile, the prince's entourage observed in silence. They had been accustomed to seeing him in control at all times, and this encounter had disrupted that expectation. They began to understand that true influence is not just about wealth or social standing. It is also about behavior, respect, and the ability to recognize the value in others. They felt a mixture of admiration and unease, realizing that their leader had experienced a rare lesson in humility. The waitress, moving gracefully between tables, reflected on how often society underestimated people based on appearance, race, or occupation. She thought about the countless times she had been overlooked, dismissed, or assumed to lack skill. And yet, in that moment, she had demonstrated that intelligence and dignity are universal qualities. Her knowledge of Arabic had been her secret tool, a way to assert herself without aggression, proving that preparation, confidence, and skill can empower anyone, regardless of circumstance. The prince finally spoke again, his tone softer, more reflective. "You've taught me something tonight," he admitted quietly, almost to himself. "I did not expect to learn this lesson from you." His words were sincere, carrying a weight that surprised even him. He felt a shift within himself, a recognition that humility and respect are not weaknesses but strengths. The waitress smiled politely, acknowledging his words without arrogance. She had no desire to boast or humiliate. Her goal had been to assert her dignity and ensure she was treated with respect. She had succeeded beyond her expectations. In doing so, she had demonstrated a rare kind of power, the ability to teach a lesson without confrontation, to change perceptions without anger, and to inspire reflection through calm confidence. As the evening wore on, the restaurant returned to its normal pace. The music softened, conversations resumed, and the sounds of service filled the space once again. Yet the memory of the encounter lingered. Patrons remembered the intelligence and composure of the young waitress and the unusual humility of the prince. It was a story that would quietly circulate, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that respect is earned through character and behavior, not assumed through status or wealth. The prince's perspective had shifted. He began to reflect on his past behavior, realizing how often he had judged people unfairly, assuming incompetence where there was none. He understood now that true leadership and influence require humility, awareness, and a willingness to recognize the strengths of others. The lesson he had learned was invaluable, not just for that evening, but for life beyond the restaurant. The waitress, moving between tables, continued to serve with grace and efficiency, yet she knew that she had done something meaningful. She had transformed a moment of potential humiliation into an opportunity for empowerment, teaching a subtle but powerful lesson in dignity and respect. She had shown that intelligence, confidence, and calm composure could challenge assumptions, shift power dynamics, and inspire reflection. In that quiet, busy restaurant, two people from very different worlds had shared a transformative experience. One had been humbled, gaining a deeper understanding of humility and respect. The other had asserted her dignity, demonstrating the power of knowledge, patience, and self-confidence. The event would remain in their memories, a reminder of how a single moment, approached with calm and intelligence, can change perspectives and inspire growth. And as the night drew to a close, the young waitress wiped down the tables and straightened the chairs, her thoughts calm and reflective. She knew that the lesson had been delivered, that the confrontation had ended not in anger but in understanding. She had faced a challenge, turned it into an opportunity, and emerged empowered. The prince, seated quietly in the corner, understood the lesson too, one that he would carry with him far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The evening was winding down, and the restaurant had returned to its usual rhythm. The soft hum of conversation, the gentle clinking of cutlery, and the low background music filled the air once more. Yet, for the prince and the young waitress, the events of the night continued to linger in their minds. What had started as a simple dinner had turned into an experience neither of them would ever forget. The prince sat quietly, staring at the remnants of his meal. His mind was filled with reflection. He had entered the restaurant expecting to assert authority, to receive service without question, and perhaps even to display a small measure of superiority. But none of that had happened. Instead, He had been confronted with a reality that challenged his assumptions and forced him to reconsider his beliefs. For the first time in a long while, he felt humility, not humiliation, but genuine humility. He thought about the words the waitress had spoken in Arabic, the precision of her language, the calm confidence in her voice. He realized that he had underestimated her from the very beginning. He had assumed that her job, her appearance, and her social position defined her intelligence and abilities. But in those few moments of interaction, she had demonstrated skill, knowledge, and courage that he could not ignore. It was a lesson that cut deeper than any criticism, because it came quietly, elegantly, and without aggression. The prince reflected further, thinking about how often he had judged people without knowing them. How many times had he dismissed someone because they did not fit his expectations? How many opportunities had he missed to learn from others because he assumed he already knew everything? He felt a stirring of awareness that he had rarely experienced. The waitress had done more than defend herself. She had shown him a mirror, reflecting his arrogance and guiding him toward understanding. Meanwhile, the waitress continued her duties, moving gracefully between tables, serving each guest with her usual calm efficiency. She had returned to the rhythm of work, but her mind was still aware of the impact of her actions. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had handled the confrontation with dignity. She had turned an insult into an opportunity for empowerment, demonstrating that confidence, intelligence, and composure could overcome arrogance and prejudice. She thought about her own journey, the challenges she had faced in life, the moments when she had been underestimated, and the times when she had had to prove her worth. All of those experiences had prepared her for this moment. She had learned patience, resilience, and the value of staying calm under pressure. And now she had seen the results of that preparation. She had faced a powerful individual, stood her ground, and emerged with her dignity intact, even inspiring reflection and respect. The patrons who had witnessed the incident quietly discussed it among themselves. Some expressed admiration for the waitress, commenting on her intelligence, her composure, and her ability to handle a difficult situation with grace. Others noted the change in the prince's demeanor, recognizing that he had been humbled in a subtle but meaningful way. The story of the confrontation spread quietly through the restaurant, not as gossip, but as a lesson in respect, dignity, and human decency. The prince's entourage remained close by, observing him carefully. They had seen him in moments of authority, but this evening had been different. They realized that true leadership and influence were not just about wealth, status, or control. They were about understanding, humility, and the ability to recognize the value in others. The young waitress had taught him a lesson that would remain with him far longer than any formal instruction or reprimand. As the restaurant began to empty and the last diners departed, the waitress prepared to close her section for the night. She moved quietly, methodically, ensuring that every table was clean and ready for the next day. Despite the exhaustion that often followed a busy evening, she felt energized. The events of the night had reminded her of her own strength and capabilities. She had faced a challenge and turned it into a moment of empowerment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The prince lingered for a moment, reflecting on what had transpired. He realized that the lesson he had learned was more valuable than any experience he had gained through wealth or privilege. He understood that humility is not a weakness but a strength. That respect is earned through behavior, not assumed through status, and that every individual, regardless of position, deserves to be treated with dignity. These insights were profound, reshaping the way he viewed the world and the people around him. He approached the waitress quietly as she was straightening chairs. There was no fanfare, no grand gesture, just a sincere acknowledgement of what had happened. I, I want to apologize," he said softly, his voice genuine. "I should not have spoken to you that way. I underestimated you and I was wrong." She had not sought an apology. Her goal had been to assert her dignity and handle the situation with grace. Yet hearing his sincere acknowledgment brought a quiet sense of closure. The tension of the evening began to dissolve, replaced by mutual respect. The prince continued, his tone reflective. "You've taught me something tonight, more than I expected to learn. I will remember this lesson." His eyes met hers, not with arrogance but with recognition. He had been humbled, and he was grateful for the insight she had provided. For the waitress, this moment was the natural conclusion of the evening. She had handled the confrontation with skill and composure. She had demonstrated the power of knowledge, patience, and dignity. And now, in this quiet acknowledgment, she saw that her efforts had not only defended her own honor, but had inspired awareness and reflection in someone accustomed to privilege. As the prince left the restaurant with his entourage, the waitress returned to her final tasks, preparing to leave for the night. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, the words spoken, the looks exchanged, the subtle shifts in behavior and awareness. She reflected on the power of calm confidence and the importance of standing firm in the face of arrogance. The lesson had been mutual. She had asserted herself, and he had learned humility. The restaurant, now empty and quiet, felt peaceful. The soft hum of lights, the gentle clink of dishes being cleaned, and the faint smell of the evening's meals created a serene atmosphere. It was as if the space itself had absorbed the lessons of the night, holding them quietly until they were needed again. The waitress stepped outside into the cool night air, feeling a sense of completion. The evening had been challenging, but it had also been affirming. She had faced an insult, transformed it into an opportunity, and emerged with her dignity intact. She understood that true strength lies not in aggression or anger, but in composure, intelligence, and self-respect. The prince, walking down the street with his entourage, was quiet. He reflected on the evening's events, realizing that he had been given a rare gift, a lesson in humility, respect, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not for what he assumed them to be. The encounter had shifted his perspective, opening his mind to a broader understanding of the world and the people within it. In the days that followed, both the waitress and the prince carried the memory of that evening with them. For the waitress, it was a reminder of her own strength, intelligence, and dignity. She continued her work with renewed confidence, knowing that she could handle challenges with grace and skill. For the prince, it was a lesson in humility, respect, and the importance of recognizing the worth of every individual. He carried it quietly, letting it shape his interactions and decisions in subtle but meaningful ways. The story of that evening, though private, had a ripple effect. The patrons who had witnessed it carried the lesson with them, sharing it in whispers and reflections. The quiet power of composure, knowledge, and dignity became an example, demonstrating that strength is not always loud and that true respect is earned, not demanded. And so, the young waitress and the prince went their separate ways, forever changed by a single evening. One had asserted her dignity and intelligence, the other had learned humility and the value of respect. In the calm, quiet conclusion of the night, both had grown, one empowered by her own abilities, the other enlightened by an unexpected lesson in humanity. The world outside the restaurant continued as it always did, full of noise, motion, and distractions. Yet in the small corner where this encounter had occurred, a moment of quiet transformation had taken place, a reminder that courage, intelligence, and dignity can create change, even in the most unexpected circumstances. And in the memory of that night, both the waitress and the prince would carry the lesson forward, each shaped by the encounter, each enriched by the understanding that respect and humility are among the most valuable qualities a person can possess.